The chandeliers of Buckingham House burned brighter than the stars that winter night, their thousand lights reflected in every polished surface, every golden goblet, every eye hungry for admiration. The air shimmered with music and murmurs, the rustle of silk gowns, the soft laughter of ladies pretending not to envy one another, and the low hum of men weighing fortunes, titles, and futures. In that glittering crowd, Lady Eleanor Whitmore stood at the edge of the ballroom, neither unseen nor welcomed. She wore her mother's gown, restitched and carefully pressed, its once ivory satin now a shade too pale to deceive anyone. Her father's debts were whispered about more freely than her virtues, and her invitation had been more courtesy than kindness. Still, she held her head high, her eyes steady, as if the weight of the world were merely another jewel at her throat. Across the room, the Duke of Wessex entered to a murmur of approval. Lord Alexander Harrow was the sort of man whose presence bent a room toward him, the posture of nobility, the calm of a man accustomed to being obeyed. His black coat was cut with immaculate precision, his cravat knotted with studied indifference. Widowed mothers studied him for their daughters, young women prayed to catch his eye. Yet his expression was remote, carved from composure itself. He believed affection to be a weakness, an indulgence for lesser men. Eleanor noticed him immediately, though she told herself she did not. He had been her father's acquaintance once, years before fortune deserted them. She remembered him as aloof even then, proud and untouchable, the kind of man who might command an empire but never truly know a soul. Their eyes met briefly across the ballroom, a flicker as faint as candlelight. He inclined his head in polite acknowledgement, she curtsied almost imperceptibly. Then both looked away, though neither forgot. The evening wore on with rehearsed elegance. Partners exchanged, toasts made, the orchestra swelling and softening like breath itself. Eleanor, ever conscious of her precarious position, moved with grace but little confidence. She had danced twice, once with a distant cousin, once with an older viscount who mistook pity for gallantry. She was retrieving a glass of champagne when the moment occurred, that small, cruel turn of fate that would mark her name in whispers. A careless servant brushed past her, the tray wobbled. She reached to steady it, and in doing so, collided with the Duke himself. A single drop of champagne fell upon his cuff, glistening like accusation. The music faltered only slightly, but in that instant, silence seemed to bloom around them. "I beg your pardon, your grace," she said softly, her voice even, though her heart had leapt to her throat. He looked at her as one might at an unexpected intrusion upon order. His words, when they came, were cool and precise. "You need not pretend proximity grants you favor, Lady Eleanor. I assure you, it does not." A small, brittle laugh from somewhere nearby. The orchestra resumed, but too late. The humiliation had already taken root. Eleanor's cheeks flushed crimson, she lowered her gaze and stepped back with perfect composure. "Then I must thank you for your honesty," she murmured, and turned away before he could see the tremor in her hand. For the rest of the evening, she moved like a ghost among the living, polite, graceful, forgotten. Yet beneath her calm exterior, something wounded and wordless stirred, not merely embarrassment, but the ache of being misjudged by a man whose opinion she had never sought, and yet could not ignore. Alexander, for his part, felt a faint unease he could not name. His words had been sharper than intended, but he told himself it was necessary. Pride demanded distance, sympathy was dangerous. The world watched him for weakness, and he had none to spare. Still, when he saw her later, standing near a window half concealed by drapery, her face turned toward the snow outside, he felt an unwelcome pang, a quiet question of whether cruelty had been his only means of self-defense. By midnight, the guests began to leave. Carriages lined the street, wheels crunching over frost. The Duke stepped out into the cold air, his breath forming clouds that vanished too quickly. He was halfway to his carriage when movement at the side door caught his attention. Lady Eleanor, her cloak drawn close, had paused beside a young servant girl kneeling in distress, the hem of her plain dress torn by a carriage step. Without hesitation, Eleanor knelt beside her, unfastening the small silver clasp from her own cloak and using it to mend the fabric. Her gloved hands worked deftly, her voice calm, reassuring. No one else saw, no one cared to. But Alexander did. Something in the simplicity of that act, so far from the vanity of the ballroom, struck through the armor he wore around his heart. The same woman he had dismissed without thought now revealed a quiet nobility that no title could bestow. He lingered longer than propriety allowed, unseen in the shadows, watching her help the girl to her feet. "Be careful on the ice," Eleanor said gently. "A lady's grace has little use when the ground itself betrays her." The servant smiled shyly, murmured thanks, and disappeared into the night. Eleanor straightened, dusting snow from her cloak, unaware of the eyes upon her. For the first time in years, Alexander felt uncertain, unsure whether he had judged her or himself too harshly. When she finally looked up, the moonlight brushed her face, softening every trace of earlier humiliation. She seemed untouchable now, not because of pride, but because of grace. The wind lifted a strand of her hair across her cheek, she tucked it away with a motion so delicate it seemed to still the air around her. Alexander exhaled slowly, as though something within him had shifted. He entered his carriage in silence, yet the echo of her kindness followed him all the way to Wessex. The image replayed in his mind, the calm of her voice, the gentleness of her hands, and with each recollection, the words he had spoken earlier sounded colder, emptier. In his study that night, firelight flickering across dark-paneled walls, he poured himself a glass of brandy and stared into its amber depths. What had possessed him to speak so cruelly? Pride, he told himself again. Always pride. But the justification rang hollow. For a man who prided himself on reason, he could not reason away the unease that settled in his chest. And somewhere in the city, in a small, dimly lit carriage on her way home, Lady Eleanor leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes. The night's humiliation still burned, but mingled with it was a strange, inexplicable sense of triumph. She had not cried, nor faltered, nor begged to be understood. Whatever else the world might think, she had remained herself, and that, she realized, was the one thing no scandal could take from her. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, two hearts, far apart and unspoken to one another, carried the same thought in silence, that perhaps the night had revealed something truer than either of them wished to see. Snow still veiled the rooftops of London a week after the ball, turning every street into a pale reflection of the sky. The season, with all its elegance and deceit, marched on. Invitations fluttered between manners like white doves carrying secrets, and among them, one rumor began to take flight, softly at first, then with the weight of scandal. Someone claimed a locket bearing the Duke of Wessex's crest had been found near Lady Eleanor Whitmore's carriage outside the royal ballroom. By afternoon, it was gossip. By evening, it was fact. And by the following dawn, it had become a stain. Eleanor learned of it over breakfast, her maid's trembling hands betraying the fear that no servant dared speak. The locket was presented by a footman, wrapped in velvet, as though handling evidence. She stared at it, uncomprehending for a long moment. The crest, two lions entwined beneath a crown, was unmistakable. She had never seen it before, yet its presence near her carriage was enough to condemn her. "Send word that I did not attend his grace beyond the ballroom," she said calmly, though her voice quivered at the edges. "If anyone asks, I was with my aunt." Her aunt, bedridden for months, would remember nothing. Eleanor knew the truth would not matter. Society required not proof, only suggestion. By noon, she could feel the weight of invisible eyes following her through the streets. At the milliner's, the whispers paused when she entered; at the bookseller's, a clerk forgot to bow. Every politeness withdrawn was another thread of respect unraveling. The Duke of Wessex, meanwhile, had spent the morning unaware of the scandal being born in his name. He was in conference with the Prime Minister's envoy, reviewing reports of trade from India, when a note arrived sealed in the Queen's colors. It was brief, impeccably phrased, and barbed with implication. "Your Grace, the Crown has received word of a matter requiring your discretion. It concerns Lady Eleanor Whitmore and an item of your possession." His hand stilled. He dismissed the envoy at once, the documents forgotten. The carriage ride to his London residence felt longer than any campaign. Inside his study, he demanded answers. None of his servants could account for the missing locket, an heirloom he had last seen weeks ago, placed upon his writing desk beside a stack of unopened letters. By evening, the connection between them was impossible to ignore. A misplaced trinket had become the foundation of scandal, and Eleanor's name was being torn apart to decorate the idle hours of nobility. The Duke could have ignored it; his reputation would survive unscathed. Yet an unfamiliar restlessness pressed at him, the image of her beneath the snow that night refusing to fade. It was not guilt that moved him at first, but curiosity. Why did it trouble him so deeply that she might be suffering unjustly? The next morning, he ordered his carriage and rode to the Whitmore estate without announcement. The house, though dignified in its bones, wore its poverty like frost. Paint peeled along the windowsills, ivy crawled over the gates as though reclaiming what wealth had abandoned. Eleanor received him in the drawing-room, her composure polished, her expression unreadable. "Your Grace," she greeted, curtsying with a restraint that felt colder than disdain. "I trust this visit is official, since gossip suggests we are already on intimate terms." Her words struck sharper than he expected. He inclined his head. "I came to address that very gossip, Lady Eleanor. It seems my locket has been discovered in your possession." "In my possession?" She laughed softly, a sound without warmth. "No, Your Grace. It was near my carriage. Close enough, perhaps, for the imagination to complete the rest." Alexander studied her, the grace in her posture, the steadiness of her tone. She was defending not merely her innocence but her dignity. He felt a flicker of admiration he would not name. "The matter is easily resolved," he said. "I will make a statement to clarify that we have no acquaintance beyond the ball." She met his gaze then, her eyes cool as winter glass. "You came to protect your name, not mine." He hesitated. "Perhaps. Yet I find my name no longer as important as the way you said that." Silence followed. Outside, snow tapped lightly against the window panes. The Duke shifted, unaccustomed to discomfort. "Your family does not deserve this shadow," he said at last. "If you permit me, I shall retrieve the locket myself and see that it is never mentioned again." "You assume I kept it," she replied. "Would it comfort you to know I could not bear to touch it? The very emblem seemed to burn my hands." Something in her voice, wounded pride wrapped in poise, moved him more than apology ever could. He reached into his coat and produced the locket he had brought with him, newly engraved, a duplicate of the lost one. "Then allow me to exchange one burden for another," he said. "This is yours, Lady Eleanor. A token of restitution, nothing more." She stared at it, then at him, confusion warring with indignation. "You would gift me the very symbol of my disgrace?" "Not as a gift," he said quietly. "As an acknowledgement that the fault was mine, for not speaking sooner." She accepted it at last, her gloved fingers brushing his. The contact was brief but electric, an unspoken truth neither dared confront. When she withdrew, her voice was soft again, tempered by exhaustion. "The world will twist this gesture as it pleases." "Then let it," he replied. "The world is easily entertained." He left soon after, leaving behind the faint scent of cedar and tobacco. When the door closed, Eleanor opened her hand and saw, beside the locket, a single white rose he had set upon the table, a symbol so unexpected it disarmed her completely. Its petals, perfect and silent, carried no message, yet she felt it speak all the same. That night, she placed both the rose and the locket inside her writing desk, unsure whether they were tokens of apology or warning. Sleep eluded her. She dreamed of the ballroom again, the spill of champagne, the flash of humiliation, and then of the moment outside in the snow, when she had been unaware of his gaze. Perhaps, she thought, he had seen something she had long stopped showing the world. Meanwhile, the Duke sat in his study once more, the firelight burning low. His valet entered quietly with an envelope, an unsigned letter delivered by hand. The script was delicate yet deliberate, unmistakably feminine. "A rose with thorns still offers beauty, if one dares to touch it." He read it twice, his pulse unsteady. There was no signature, yet he did not need one. He placed the letter beside the glass of brandy and stared into the flames. For the first time in years, Alexander Harrow, Duke of Wessex, felt the fragile beginnings of doubt not in her innocence, but in his own heart's discipline. Outside, the snow began again, soft and unending, as though the world itself conspired to keep its secrets beneath a white and perfect silence. The storm had begun long before Eleanor reached the edge of the city, the sky dark with clouds that swallowed the sun whole. Rain streaked down in relentless sheets, tapping against the windows of the Duke of Wessex's carriage as if the heavens themselves demanded confession. Each turn of the wheels on the cobblestones echoed in her chest, a rhythm that matched the nervous flutter of her heart. She was summoned under the pretense of clearing her name before the Queen's Council, a summons that carried both threat and promise. The streets were nearly deserted, the usual bustle muted by the weather, leaving only the wind and her thoughts as companions. Alexander had already been waiting in the library, the scent of burning oak mingling with the sharp tang of rain that crept in at the window seams. Candles cast trembling shadows on the walls, illuminating books whose spines had been worn smooth by centuries of study. He moved with a restlessness unusual for a man accustomed to control, stopping once at the hearth to pour brandy, then pacing to the window, then back again. Each movement betrayed the inner turmoil he refused to name. When he heard the carriage halt, he straightened and forced his expression into its usual calm mask, though it felt brittle beneath the weight of anticipation. Eleanor entered with measured steps, water dripping from the hem of her cloak. The storm had left her hair damp, the dark strands clinging to her face, yet it only seemed to enhance her composure rather than diminish it. Alexander observed her, noting the quiet dignity that did not require decoration or applause. She curtsied with precision, then lifted her eyes to meet his, and in that brief instant, the world outside, the storm, the rumors, the expectations, fell away. "Your Grace," she said, voice steady, though the tremor beneath it spoke more than she wished. "You summon me for matters of propriety, I presume. Shall we dispense with formality and speak plainly?" He inclined his head, silently granting permission, though the words to follow were heavier than any formality could bear. "Yes," he said. "Plainly. I am aware of the locket, of the whispers, and of the way the world seeks to bind your name to mine in error." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "And what of the truth, Your Grace? Does it not matter at all?" For the world, truth is rarely considered, he admitted. But for myself, I find it matters more than I could have imagined. Her brow lifted in surprise. This was not the cold, distant Duke of the ballroom. This was a man exposed to uncertainty, a man who, perhaps for the first time, acknowledged the tremor in his own judgment. Eleanor took a careful step closer, the space between them charged with unspoken weight. Then speak, she said. Tell me what you wish me to hear, and I shall listen. Alexander hesitated, as though the words themselves carried the risk of disaster. I have observed you, he confessed at last, his voice low and deliberate. Not merely at the ball, where circumstances demanded attention, but afterwards, when you were unseen. When you assisted a young girl, simple and unobserved, I found that what I thought frivolity was instead strength, compassion, nobility. You moved with a grace that no title could grant, and in that moment, I realized the error of my pride. Eleanor's hands, gloved and still, clenched slightly at her sides. You speak of observation, your grace. Not understanding. I am accustomed to being watched, yet seldom to being known. You are known, he said, stepping closer, though still careful to maintain the proprieties demanded by society. Perhaps not by the world, but by me. And it is an understanding I cannot unsee. I once mistook pride for strength. Now I see that fear of attachment was the true weakness. A quiet stillness fell between them, punctuated only by the patter of rain against the windows. Eleanor's gaze softened, yet her voice remained measured. And what am I to do with this knowledge, your grace? The world has already drawn its conclusions. My family suffers in the shadows of your name, and any misstep could destroy what little dignity remains. You do not have to act upon the world's conclusion, he said gently. You may exist beyond its scrutiny if you wish. But I cannot deny what I see, nor ignore what I feel. Her breath caught at the rare vulnerability in his tone. Alexander Harrow, Duke of Wessex, so long a figure of composed detachment, now revealed a tremor of humanity that no title could contain. Eleanor's voice softened in turn, revealing the fragility beneath her armor. And yet you summon me here, into the storm, to speak truths that could ignite further scandal. How does one navigate such danger with dignity intact? By acknowledging it, he replied, and by understanding that dignity is not defined by appearances but by the courage to face one's own heart. They stood in the library, two figures caught in the amber glow of candlelight, the storm outside a reflection of the turbulence within. Words became unnecessary. Each glance, each small shift of posture, conveyed the tension and the longing both refused to name. Hands nearly met, paused, then retreated, restrained by duty and the invisible chains of expectation. Eleanor's eyes drifted to the hearth, where embers glowed faintly, and she allowed herself the smallest exhale, a concession to trust. I have lived under the scrutiny of others for too long, she admitted softly. To be seen by someone without judgment is unfamiliar. You are seen, Alexander assured her. And I wish to see you fully, without the interference of society, without the weight of expectation. Yet I am constrained, as are you, by the rules we cannot ignore. A long moment passed. Rain streaked the windows like tears of the storm itself, and the firelight flickered against their faces. Eleanor extended a gloved hand, almost imperceptibly, not for touch but for the acknowledgement of connection. Alexander watched it hover, fragile and tentative, before meeting her gaze. In that silent accord, the first bridge was built between them, not through grand gestures, not through declarations, but through the quiet admission that two hearts, restrained yet resolute, had recognized one another. She departed before dawn, stepping back into the rain and shadows, leaving behind a space heavy with unspoken confession. Alexander remained by the window, staring after her retreating figure, a hand resting upon the locket he still held. The storm outside mirrored the storm within him, both relentless and unyielding. On her return, Eleanor placed the locket upon her writing desk, alongside the faint impression of a white rose he had left behind days before. She traced its petals absent-mindedly, contemplating the confession he had offered, the vulnerability he had revealed. For the first time, she felt not just vindication but the stirring of something far more dangerous, hope. Alexander, alone in his study, read once again the small letter she had sent previously. A rose with thorns still offers beauty, if one dares to touch it. Tonight, however, he felt its meaning deepen, as if it were less a riddle and more a prophecy. He poured a second glass of brandy, unsteady for reasons no nobleman would admit, and stared into the flickering fire. For the first time, he understood that the heart is not governed by decorum or title, but by the quiet, irrevocable pull of truth. And in that understanding, both Eleanor and Alexander were forever changed.
The world beyond the library walls continued its relentless judgment, yet within that candlelit room, the rules of society had momentarily fallen away, leaving only two hearts navigating the delicate balance of pride, fear, and unspoken yearning. The path ahead remained uncertain, tangled with duty and rumor, yet the first step had been taken. They had seen one another, fully, and had survived the storm together. Spring had arrived with all its deceptive gentleness, sunlight gilding the manicured gardens of Windsor Palace, yet beneath the beauty of blossoms and trimmed hedges, tension lay thick as the scent of lilacs in the air. Nobility gathered in fine silks and polished boots, the hum of polite conversation weaving through the terrace like a delicate tapestry. Among the crowd moved Lady Eleanor Whitmore, her posture serene, her dark gown trimmed with discreet lace that spoke of elegance, not extravagance. Rumors of her family's imminent loss of their ancestral estate had reached every corner of the palace. Whispers followed her like shadows, and every glance carried judgment, curiosity, or outright envy. She walked with the measured steps of one who had learned to bear the weight of the world gracefully, each movement a silent assertion of dignity in defiance of society's scorn. The Duke of Wessex observed her from a distance, his coat impeccably tailored, gloves polished, yet tension etched across his brow. He was aware of every murmur that rose around them, every eye that flicked from him to Eleanor and back again. A man of his station could have ignored the gossip, letting scandal wash over like rain from a distant storm, yet something deeper compelled him to act. It was not merely the preservation of propriety, nor the defense of reputation. It was the knowledge that Eleanor's worth, and the quiet grace with which she bore herself, demanded acknowledgment beyond polite gesture. He approached her when the court was assembled near the fountain, its waters glimmering under the spring sun. The crowd parted slightly, some whispering curiosity, others disapproval, yet his eyes held only Eleanor. She lifted her gaze to meet his, expression carefully neutral, but the faint quiver of her lips betrayed awareness of the moment's gravity. "Lady Eleanor," he began, voice steady though underpinned by an emotion he did not yet name aloud, "it appears the fates are less forgiving than the Queen herself. Your family's estate, your home, stands at risk. Society delights in whispers, yet offers no mercy for truth." She inclined her head, lips pressing into a line of composure that masked the panic gnawing at her chest. "I have long known that discretion is a luxury I cannot afford, Your Grace," she replied evenly. "The world is seldom concerned with fairness, and I am accustomed to its disregard. Yet justice," he said, stepping closer, "need not be absent when courage prevails. Your family will not lose what is theirs while I am able to prevent it." The assembly stirred, some noblemen leaning forward with interest, others exchanging knowing glances. Such intervention by the Duke was daring, bordering on impropriety. Eleanor's heart quickened, not out of fear alone, but from the recognition that Alexander had chosen to place principle, and perhaps sentiment, above expectation. He addressed the court with a voice calm yet resolute, commanding attention. "The decree that threatens Lady Eleanor Whitmore's estate is unjust, and I, Duke of Wessex, offer to settle the debts owed, ensuring the property remains in her name. Let it be known that no man's ambition shall profit from another's misfortune while honor remains my guide." Murmurs rippled through the assembly. The Queen's council exchanged glances, some skeptical, others impressed by the boldness of his declaration. Eleanor's breath caught, her hand resting lightly on the hem of her gown to steady the trembling she had yet to acknowledge. She had been shielded many times in her life, but never so publicly, never so decisively. Alexander turned then, his eyes locking with hers, the intensity of his gaze leaving no room for misinterpretation. "I once swore I would never marry you, Lady Eleanor," he said, voice low but carrying across the terrace. "Yet one night, seeing you, witnessing your strength, your grace, your unyielding kindness, made me realize that the heart's judgment cannot be restrained by pride or expectation. I have fallen for you, utterly and irrevocably, and I shall not deny it." A silence descended over the court, thick and expectant. The flowers seemed to pause in mid-bloom, the fountain's waters suspended in sparkling arcs as though nature itself waited for her response. Eleanor's eyes glistened, yet she did not immediately speak. The world outside, the expectations, the gossip, the whispering nobles, faded to irrelevance. She saw only him, and the raw sincerity in his expression, a vulnerability few had ever witnessed from a man so trained in composure. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her chin and allowed herself a single, measured nod. "Then, if it is true that you speak from the heart, Your Grace, I have no choice but to acknowledge it," she said softly. "I have lived in the shadow of society's judgment for too long. Perhaps it is time to step into the light, guided by the truth of what we feel, rather than the dictates of others." The Duke's lips curved in a rare, genuine smile. He extended his hand, not as a gesture of dominance, but of partnership, of trust. Eleanor placed her gloved hand in his, the simple touch conveying more than words could encompass. In that connection, the rumors, the scandal, and the whispered judgments melted away, replaced by something far stronger, mutual recognition of courage, respect, and unspoken longing. The crowd watched, some in admiration, others in disbelief. Yet no matter their judgment, the moment had crystallized into a truth that neither wealth, title, nor expectation could undo. Alexander's voice, once distant and formal, now carried warmth, sincerity, and resolve. Together, we shall face what remains of the world's scrutiny, unbowed and unafraid. The heart is the truest measure of honor, and mine has spoken plainly at last. Eleanor's eyes softened, her composure giving way to the first hint of unrestrained relief. Then let it be so, she whispered, her voice almost lost in the gentle rustle of spring leaves. Let the world witness not scandal, but courage. Not judgment, but the quiet victory of truth. The Duke's grip tightened, a silent promise of protection and devotion. For the first time in both their lives, the rules of society and the expectations of title aligned, if only briefly, with the desires of the heart. They stood together on the terrace, the sun breaking through clouds to illuminate their figures, as if endorsing the union of will, heart, and principle. Behind them, the murmurs of court faded, replaced by a deeper, more enduring resonance. Their story, born of pride, scandal, and quiet observation, had reached its apex, yet it was only the beginning of a shared journey, one that would demand continued courage and mutual trust. In this single, decisive moment, Eleanor and Alexander had crossed the threshold from uncertainty to conviction, from restraint to acknowledgement, and from separate lives into the delicate interweaving of two hearts committed, not for convenience, but for truth. As the garden seemed to hold its breath, a gentle breeze carried the scent of lilacs and fresh earth, mingling with the subtle perfume Eleanor always wore. The Duke's gaze lingered on her face, memorizing the expression of dignity and wonder, while she, in turn, allowed herself a fleeting smile, the kind that spoke of relief, hope, and the quiet triumph of love over fear. Together, they walked slowly toward the palace doors, hands brushing, eyes locked, the world's judgment diminished by the undeniable authority of shared courage. The fountains glittered in the sunlight, birds flitted among the blossoms, and somewhere, the faint echo of the storm from days past seemed a distant memory, replaced by the promise of a spring unbroken and a future unbound. In the hush that followed, the significance of the day settled gently over them. They had not merely declared intention, nor had they simply defended honor, they had dared to let the heart speak above all else. And in that daring, the world, for once, could only watch. Years had passed since that spring morning at Windsor Palace, yet the memory lingered as vividly as the first blush of dawn. The Wessex estate, once shadowed by debts and whispers, now thrived under the careful guidance of its Duke and Duchess. Blossoms unfurled in the gardens like memories returning to life, and the fountains danced with sunlight, echoing the laughter that had once been scarce in its halls. Eleanor walked among the flower beds, her gown light with spring silk, her hands brushing over petals with a tenderness that mirrored her quiet strength. She moved with a confidence earned through adversity, the trials of society having sharpened her instincts without diminishing her grace. The estate itself seemed to breathe under her touch, a living testament to resilience and care. Alexander followed, his coat neatly fitted, gloves tucked under one arm, but his gaze was fixed on her, not the surroundings. The years had added depth to his features but softened none of the composure that marked him as a duke. There was, however, an unmistakable light in his eyes whenever Eleanor approached, a warmth that neither title nor time could dim. He had long since abandoned the rigid detachment that once defined him, his strength now lay in restraint, judgment guided not by pride but by understanding and empathy. The garden, with its sunlit paths and gentle fragrance, had become the stage of their shared life, a place where silence spoke as eloquently as words. They paused near the fountain where water cascaded in delicate arcs, sunlight igniting droplets like scattered jewels. Eleanor's eyes lifted to Alexander, and a small, knowing smile curved her lips. It was a smile born of shared history, of moments survived, and victories claimed, not from society's approval, but from their own courage. "Do you remember," she asked softly, "the first time we stood on a terrace like this, when the world seemed ready to condemn us before it even knew us?" Alexander nodded, a trace of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I do. I was reckless in my pride then, and perhaps far too certain that the heart could be tamed by decorum." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I have learned that courage is not found in the absence of fear, but in the willingness to act despite it. And you taught me that lesson better than any tutor or counsel ever could." Eleanor felt a warmth rise in her chest. There was no need for grand declarations now. Their bond had been forged in the quiet courage of countless small moments, in acts of observation, in confessions whispered in the shadow of candlelight. The scandal, the rumors, the tensions of court, all that had threatened to unravel them, were now threads woven into the tapestry of a shared life. She reached for his hand, letting her fingers brush against his, and in that simple touch, reaffirmed what words could never fully capture. They walked along the garden path, speaking of small things, plans for summer gatherings, improvements to the orchards, letters from friends and distant relatives, but beneath the mundane, there was a current of deeper understanding. Each glance carried the memory of nights spent in quiet conversation, each pause the acknowledgement of trials weathered together. The estate had become more than a home, it was a sanctuary shaped by their hands and hearts, a place where dignity and love coexisted without contradiction. Later, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the manicured lawns, they came upon the old library. Its windows glimmered in the fading light, the scent of oak and paper inviting them inside. Alexander opened the door with a flourish, a small gesture that spoke of his enduring attentiveness. Inside, they found the room as they had left it years before, books carefully arranged, the fireplace polished, the quiet order preserved. Eleanor set down her gloves and removed a small envelope from her cloak pocket. "It arrived this morning," she said, placing it gently on the writing desk. "A letter from the Crown, acknowledging your intervention on our behalf all those years ago. They commend not only your courage but your integrity." Alexander allowed himself a rare, unguarded smile. "It is remarkable," he said, "how a single act can ripple outward and alter the course of so many lives." He paused, glancing at Eleanor. "And yet the most remarkable change was the one that began here, in these very halls, between us. For it was not the world's judgment I needed to overcome, but my own." She reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. "And you did, as I did," she replied. "Together, we discovered that the truest measure of honor is not in titles or estates, but in the courage to follow the heart, even when every expectation advises otherwise." A silence fell, not of awkwardness, but of contentment, a pause in which the years seemed to condense into a single, golden moment. Outside, the last rays of the sun struck the glass of the library, illuminating the edges of the letter, the curves of Eleanor's face, the faint smile of Alexander's lips. The estate, the gardens, the fountains, all became background to the quiet triumph of two hearts fully aligned. As evening settled, they moved to the terrace, where lanterns had been lit to chase the creeping shadows. The night was soft and fragrant, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of lilacs and newly turned earth. Eleanor leaned lightly against Alexander's arm, feeling the steady pulse beneath the gloves that had once concealed nervous trembling. She no longer carried the weight of scrutiny, it had been replaced by the certainty of partnership, of shared purpose and unspoken devotion. Alexander, mindful of the years and the lessons they had imparted, spoke in a tone that was both reflective and tender. "The world may change, Eleanor, yet the lessons we learned, about courage, patience, and seeing one another truly, will remain. And I intend that we never forget them." She nodded, her eyes reflecting the lantern light and a lifetime of experience. "Nor should we. They are ours, and ours alone. No rumor, no scandal, no expectation can diminish the truth we have found together." They stood in silence for a while longer, watching the night deepen, the gardens shimmering under the silver of the rising moon. Every fountain, every flower, every shadow seemed to echo their journey, from whispered judgment to quiet understanding, from isolation to the warmth of shared trust. The estate had survived the tempests of fortune and reputation, just as they had survived the tempests of the heart. Finally, Alexander guided Eleanor toward the central path, their hands entwined, their pace unhurried.